So in the early part of our unit, we looked at the peaceful side of protest in the civil rights movement. Now we're going to continue with our journey through the more radical side of the civil rights movement. And so our goals for today are to describe the goals and tactics of the Black Panther Party and to describe the race riots that erupted during the 1960s. So we begin with the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were a group that was formed in Oakland, California in October of 1966. You won't need to know the date. They were formed by a guy named Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Again, you won't need to know their names, but these were two guys who believed in their constitutional rights. They firmly understood their constitutional rights, but they believed that things like the peaceful nonviolent side of the civil rights movement weren't doing enough. Now, this doesn't mean that the Black Panthers were violent. Sometimes violence did erupt based on what they were doing and how they were doing it, but their goal was not to be violent. Their goal was actually to try to avoid violence, but they also believed that African Americans should fight back when confronted by the unjust police officers and the unjust white system. So when we look at the goals of the Black Panthers, maybe the side that most people don't realize about the Black Panthers, they really just wanted African Americans to be able to live on their own, to be self-sufficient. They didn't want African Americans to have to rely on white people to provide them with jobs or food or clothing. They believed that African Americans should be able to take care of themselves and should be able to run their own communities without having to rely on or ask white people for assistance. And so one of the ways that they wanted to get there was through full employment. The idea that all African Americans would have a job. They also believed that all African Americans were entitled to decent housing, a good meal on the table every day. These are not really unreasonable expectations. They're not unreasonable requests, but these were some things that the Black Panthers were fighting for. The other thing that the Black Panthers were fighting for, and maybe this side that gets a little more radical, is the idea of police brutality. The Black Panthers knew that the cops would pick on African Americans. There were an unjust number of beatings, and we've already learned about the violence. We looked at how people like Martin Luther King Jr., who were trying to be peaceful and nonviolent, we looked at how they were met by the police. And the Black Panthers believed that African Americans, well, shouldn't give in to that they should stand up, that they should fight for their rights, they should fight for their freedom, and that they shouldn't be pushed around. And so what maybe made the Black Panthers a little bit more radical is the idea that they believed in standing up. So instead of taking the punches, instead of just rolling with the flow and trying to prove that white people were wrong by showing how terrible they acted, instead the Black Panthers believed that African Americans should stand up for themselves. So let's look at the good things that the Black Panthers did before we turn to the more radical side of the Black Panthers. First of all, if we're talking about self-sufficiency for African Americans, one of the things that they did was come up with daycare centers. One of the issues that a lot of people had is if you've got a job, if you're working, you can't take care of your kids. And so a lot of African Americans were lower income because many of the women couldn't work because they were too busy taking care of their kids all the day. So if you've got daycare centers, now all of a sudden African American women can go out and get jobs and they can earn money. Another problem is starvation, or at least malnourishment in the African American community. So one of the things the Black Panthers did is they had lunch centers where you get a free breakfast or a free lunch. You could start out the day with a good meal. They set up free medical clinics. So if you needed to go to the doctor, if you were getting sick, the doctors within the Black Panther Party would take care of you. And they also had a program for homeless African Americans. So they did a lot of really social justice things, a lot of really good things that I think sometimes get overlooked because of the other approach that the Black Panthers took, and that was sort of the let's stand up for our rights. And so in other cases, we've known that people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for peace and nonviolence. The Black Panthers, they're not calling for violence. Let's be clear. The Black Panthers would have preferred to have nonviolence as well, but they also believed that if white people use violence, particularly the cops, that it was the power of the African Americans to fight back. And so a big part of this idea of self-defense is using weapons, using arms. And so in a number of cases, the police and the Black Panthers got into a number of shootouts, and unfortunately this is where the Black Panthers, for all the good they did, maybe earned somewhat of a bad reputation for what happened. They were very confrontational when it came to the police. So here's a poem. I think it sums things up. This was written by a member of the Black Panther Party. You're a man, you see, and a man must be whatever he'll be, or he won't be free. If he's bound up tight, he'll hold back the night, and there won't be no light for day. Well then, believe it, my friend, that silence will end. We'll just have to get guns and be men. Again, a big part of the Black Panther Party was using the Second Amendment, using the right to keep and bear arms to defend themselves. Now, most of the time, Black Panthers did not want to fight. They didn't want to get into gun battles with the cops, but they did believe that guns were a sense of intimidation. They believed in their legal Second Amendment right to carry guns, and so they would oftentimes go into very public places carrying guns, carrying weapons, and just showing it as a sign of force. You got a bunch of African American men walking around with guns, that's a sign of force. You got a bunch of white men walking around with guns, that's a sign of force. And so African Americans were really willing to use the open carry laws and the open carry policy to many times confront the police officers, especially when things got a little bit out of hand. When they were questioned by it, they would just cite their constitutional rights. These were an educated group of people. These weren't stupid people. These men who were running the Black Panther Party were very well spoken, very well educated, and they knew how to use the rights to their advantage. And so one time they would often meet in very public places, city halls and courthouses, and they would openly carry weapons just to show, hey, we know we've got the right to open weapons and open carry of weapons. Now, again, hopefully the idea was that they'd never have to use them, but they did want to show that they understood their right. Unfortunately for the Black Panthers, a lot of times they were under the scrutiny of the FBI. Sometimes the FBI's investigations were legal and were legit, but other times the FBI had some sort of illegal search and seizure on many of the Black Panther parties. And so this too leads to a lot of tension between the police and the Black Panther Party. Now, Martin Luther King Jr., what do you think MLK is going to say about the Black Panthers? Yes, well, they both have the same goals. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black Panthers have very different ways of achieving those goals. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, believed in peace and nonviolence, and so when the Black Panthers were oftentimes confrontational with the police, Martin Luther King Jr. very much disagreed with them. He also thought that by African Americans carrying around guns and confronting the police, that this only alienated white people, especially the police. This only angered white people more. And while Martin Luther King Jr. Understood why the Black Panthers were doing what they were doing, he believed that this was only creating more of a divide instead of helping the situation. All right, race riots. So between the years 1965 and 1967, in that short period of time, there were over 100 race riots that took place all across the country. And so you can see these race riots dotted upon this map. Many of them were very violent. Many of them led to shootouts. We're not going to look at every single one, because obviously we could go through this for days, but I do want you to see that there were some more violent side to the civil rights movement. And so we'll take a look at a couple key cities and a couple of the key protests. Of course, not the only ones, but these are some of the bigger ones and some of the more important ones. So first, in July of 1964 in Harlem, New York. Remember Harlem from the Harlem Renaissance, this predominantly African-American community, a bustling place, a pretty well-to-do place at the time, and unfortunately a white police officer killed a 15-year-old student, which led to an enormous breakout of tension between African-Americans and white people in the city, and this will lead to one of the earlier major race riots across the country. Killer cops will not go free, as the sign says. Another famous race riot was the Watt Race Riot, which took place in Los Angeles. You don't need to know the background story, but there was an African American who was accused of drunk driving, and his mother came to kind of defend him because she was right outside the house. It wasn't too far from the house, and then the cops start roughing up his mom, and that turns into this whole big to-do, and that eventually leads to the Watt Race Riots. The Watt being a neighborhood in Los Angeles.
6 days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles left behind scenes reminiscent of war-torn cities. More than 100 square blocks were decimated by fire and looters, and few buildings were left intact. Firemen were harassed by snipers and brick-throwing hoodlums as they attempted to control the fires, many of which were left to burn themselves out. As the National Guard moved in to restore comparative calm, the losses by fire alone were put at $200 million. No attempt has yet been made to estimate the losses suffered at the hands of the looters who stole everything from liquor to playpens. Firemen were later issued flak suits of bulletproof mesh to protect them from snipers who continued to shoot from rooftops. Nearly 3,000 were arrested, and authorities had to open abandoned jails to house those netted by the police. It took the appearance of 14,000 troops to bring an end to what both Negro and white leaders called insurrection by hoodlums.
So obviously this is a very contentious situation. You've got firefighters and police who are trying to put out the fires and trying to save people, and they're being shot at, and there's just no win in the race riots. That leads to violence, and then the white police respond with violence, and then of course with that violence African Americans get even more upset, which leads to more violence, and this is just really a not good situation all around. At the end of the race riots, over 34 people were killed, over 1,000 people were injured, and again, this led to more and more tensions between the African American community and the police. And then probably one of the worst race riots, or at least the weirdest ones to look at, is the Chicago race riots. We often think of the North as being a place where African Americans were welcomed. We know that there are still a lot of racial tensions even in the North. Of course, we know that there are not Jim Crow laws in the North. It is not a legal part of segregation, but still there's still a lot of inequality between African Americans and white people in the North, particularly in where people chose to live. And so there was a white neighborhood, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Led a peaceful march and protest through that white neighborhood, demanding fair housing for African Americans. Not defending more, not defending less, just fighting for fair housing for everybody. And we'll see the way that Dr. King was met. Yes, that's the police, basically beating up on African Americans in a peaceful, nonviolent protest. This is one of the craziest things. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gets hit in the head with a rock, and you're going to see a clip of this in the video, and he keeps going on, and he doesn't fight back. He doesn't get angry. And once again, if we talk about the media being a sign and a symbol to white people that, look, this isn't right, what you're doing to African Americans is not right, this will be another sign and symbol to many white people that, what you're doing is wrong. And it really helps further the cause of the civil rights movement when people see that the way that Dr. King reacted, when they see Dr. King just turn the other cheek, and instead of fighting back and getting violent, he just said, we got to keep marching on.
Violence to launch a series of marches into all white suburbs. By moving north and by concerning itself with equality in housing and employment, the civil rights movement began to encounter increased resistance, the so-called white backlash. During these marches, King and other demonstrators were struck by bricks and bottles.
Oh, I've been hit so many times, I'm immune to it.
How do you feel about this reception?
Well, this is a terrible thing. I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago.
But the march will go on anyway?
Oh, very definitely. We can't stop the march. We've been going on in a few minutes.
You feel you're in a close society, Dr. King, here in the Southwest side?
Oh, yes. It's definitely a closed society. And we're going to make it an open society.
Stand up a little bit.
And we feel that we have to do it this way in order to bring the evil out into the open. so that this community was.
So perhaps one of the most famous, or the most famous riot, was the uprising or rebellion in Detroit in 1967. But we'll take a little bit more of a closer look at this in class. We'll look at Detroit before the riots, what caused the riots, and then of course Detroit after the riots. For now, have a great day.